All right, joining us for more on this is SABC News International Editor Sophie Mokoena. Good evening, Sophie. So the Chinese president has indeed arrived in Moscow. Just tell us about the significance of these celebrations marking the 80th anniversary of the Victory Great Patriotic War.
It has been a tradition in Russia to celebrate or to observe the Victory Day. As you know, that the then Soviet Union played a very prominent role in the Second World War, and that led to the defeat of the Nazis in Germany. And therefore, Russia always celebrate or observe this day as a country that also contributed to that way of ending the Second World War. But it's not only Russia. We saw Ukraine also doing the same today, and other countries that were part of the alliance that defeated the Nazi Germany. And we know that President Donald Trump also has indicated that going forward, he is going to ensure that the Americans themselves do celebrate or observe or commemorate the Victory Day.
Now, Beijing and Moscow have also vowed to strengthen bilateral ties. Just for the benefit of those who might not be aware, just share with us some of those current bilateral ties that they enjoy.
You know, it is in different fields. As you saw earlier on, President Xi Jinping and President Vladimir Putin talking about the motor sector, and also on issues that are related to oil and gas. And we had earlier on President Vladimir Putin saying that they are paying China using their own local currency, and also whatever China is buying or importing from Russia, they use their own currency, and therefore it's quite a strong bond between the two leaders, including issues of culture, as you can see in terms of the body language of the two leaders when President Xi Jinping arrived at the State House or at Moscow. President Vladimir Putin was waiting, and you could see the relationship and how he received him, that there is a strong relationship between the two countries. That would include both countries being members of BRICS group, and also members of the South-South Cooperation, supporting other developing countries, and the two countries trying to ensure that even the voice of those developing and poorer nations, the voice of the South-South is heard.
And then, Sophie, I can't let you go before we just touch on the very significant moment that took place today. That's the election of Cardinal Robert Prevost as Pope. He's now Pope Leo XIV. You know, many, Sophie, had assumed that possibly it would take more than just these 2 days, perhaps Fridays, when many would have learned or seen that white smoke being emitted from the chimney. But it all happened today. Quite an interesting day we've observed.
When you look at the legacy of the late Pope Francis, you'll realize that most of these cardinals were appointed by Pope Francis. And therefore, in other words, those would be people who would have understood exactly where the church is supposed to be in this century. And therefore, for me, it was not a surprise that it didn't take that long for the conclave to come up with a two-thirds majority in relation to the election of Pope Leo XIV, because you look at the relationship Pope Francis had with most of these cardinals. Most of them, these were the people who had similar views in terms of where the church must be at this moment, not only in relation to the Catholic doctrine, but also generally what's happening around the world. And therefore, when you look at the new Pope, you will realize that he is very clear in terms of issues of migration, immigration, refugees, sharing the same views with the late Pope Francis. You look at trying to fight for the poor and the marginalized. He is also sharing the same views with Pope Francis. And lastly, the opening words were in relation to peace. In other words, almost taking from the last words of Pope Francis, the late Pope Francis, where in his last message he called for peace, even though he went further to point out areas where you need this peace. For Pope Leo XIV, it was a general statement, but the issue of peace. And that speaks to the kind of person the church felt that perhaps at this moment where there's so much division in the world and among nations, among Christians, among people with different norms and values and beliefs, you needed someone like him. So I think there was an understanding when the cardinals got into that hall and where they were given a task to elect the new leader of the church, that we are somewhere, we can't go back, even though we must still ensure that the key doctrines of the church are maintained, but we have to be here and we have to move forward looking back at what Pope Francis was talking about in relation to the church, but on other global issues. The other issue that I realize they have in common is the issue of women and leadership. In the church, they share the same views, and therefore I think a majority of the cardinals that were also appointed by Pope Francis understood where the church is at the moment and the responsibility of the church, not only Catholic, but the church in general, the religious leadership, where they are supposed to be at this challenging moment where we see conflict in Ukraine, we see the conflict in the Middle East, the conflict in the DRC, Sudan, and now tonight, scary moment in Asia where Pakistan and India are now engaged in a very tense standoff.
It was certainly quite worrying, those developments there in that area of Kashmir. Sophie, as always, thank you very much for your reportage. That's SABC News International Editor Sophie Mokoena speaking to us there.